Most people are familiar with encountering strangeness. But what is it like to find in everything around in one's very own existence to feel strange? What does it mean to be foreign, alien, to not feel at home while desperately needing to? All of these are questions explored in Shaun Tan's graphic novel The Arrival, originally published in 2007, a story told solely through illustrations without narration or speech, and rendered all the more expressive by it. It tells the story of an unnamed man who immigrates to a faraway land in order to make enough money for his wife and child to follow him, presumably because they are fleeing some form of oppression in their place of origin. On this journey, he encounters many new things and people, most of which confuse or astonish him, until he begins to slowly understand and fit in. There have been examinations of Tan's general style, his tendency to communicate primarily without using written words, as well as the recurring themes of immigration and belonging in his entire body of work. Among the most striking ones found in The Arrival, two are closely connected. How does Tan portray the vague and daunting concept of the foreign while only using imagery? And secondly, how does he communicate the graphic novel's namesake, Arrival? Exploring these questions should lead to a clearer understanding of which decisions were made to give the story its title and implicit focus, instead of another undoubtedly fitting one like The Departure, or A New Beginning, or The Stranger. And, possibly, why that precise title is so meaningful and important. An attempt at answering these questions is one of my papers. Let's start with the portrayal and the conveyance of the concepts in The Arrival. Its detailed art and complete absence of written language, or at least comprehensible written language, we'll get to that in a second, offer a lot of room for interpretation. The two biggest themes that are constantly intertwined here are the foreign and the idea of arrival. For the former, this is achieved through a combination of making the reader feel vicariously foreign through the protagonist and the foreign environment that evokes these feelings. For Arrival, the portrayal may seem less obvious at first, but indications have been strewn carefully throughout the entire story and continuously gain prevalence as it progresses. In fact, part of this effect is evoked by the exact same devices that, on the surface, underline the foreign. So in line with that, let's start with the foreign. The foreign, now be that the feeling or the term for things unknown and not indigenous, or the general idea of from the outside. I have a footnote here. Yes, I have a footnote here that literally quotes the Merriam-Webster's Collegiate Dictionary. So yes, one definition for the foreign is indeed from the outside. Now you know. It's the central motive used in Tan's narrative to create meaning and evoke emotion. This is done visually by presenting both the protagonist and the readers with a very foreign environment that they can neither understand nor fully assess initially. And side note, that means both the literal environment for the protagonist in the form of nature, structures, people, etc., or the environment for the reader created through the methods employed by the graphic novel to tell its story. But it's also done mentally by creating within the characters, and therefore by extension within the readers, feelings of wonder, but also alienation and frustration through these visual cues. Splitting that up into those two categories, let's start with the foreign as the environment. The foreign is introduced to readers even before the story sets off. After an inside cover filled with photographs of immigrants, or, well, pencil drawings of photos of immigrants, we'll put a pin in that. I'll talk a bit more about those photos later. After that, readers are instantly faced with an additional cover that is styled to look like the outside of a parcel or an international letter. On it are two lines of writing in a fictional alphabet. The first line cannot be deciphered initially, while the second one looks similar enough to the Latin spelling of Shaun Tan to, combined with the contextual knowledge of being a title page, figure out what this piece of writing most likely is, the title of the graphic novel and the author's name. So without even having introduced the story or any characters yet, Tan achieves through this what sets the tone for the entire narrative. The feeling of not understanding, of having to draw from context, of embarking on a journey into the unknown. Now, although the story starts off with pictures that communicate familiarity and comfort, a child's drawing, a family picture, a hung-up hat, household items, even on the first page, there is a disruption in the form of a suitcase, a clear symbol for departure and, by extension, the potential for foreignness. This then becomes the clear focus over the next few pages that detail the last steps in said departure. Yet it is not until page 5 that the next big indicator of the foreign is introduced in the form of a shadow on the wall, a giant, spiked shadow in the shape of a tail or a vine. The dark entities responsible for said shadows are revealed on the next 2 pages, where they can be seen spreading through the streets of the city our protagonist supposedly calls home. It is left ambiguous whether this spiked tapering cone is all there is to this shape or not. The only indication of other body parts is something that looks like a foot at the very edge of the panel. But regardless of whether these are dragons or other types of serpents or something else entirely, what they do mainly and what they're there for is to create a menacing environment. An environment that has become foreign and feels uncomfortable, unfamiliar, even threatening to the characters. And the way this feeling is communicated to readers is the usage of a mythical, unexplained entity instead of quote-unquote realistic circumstances that might evoke similar but different dread, such as hostile animals or people, destruction, or human suffering. Through the usage of color tone, shape, lighting, and scale, Tan paints a clear picture of the family's uneasiness and potential unsafeness as they walk down the street. He manages to communicate this emotion to readers without using imagery they are familiar with beyond thematic association. This is important because readers are specifically led to empathize and draw their understanding from context, instead of being faced with a more independently and clearly meaningful representation of danger that would require a certain familiarity, which is exactly what we don't want here. This choice was clearly made in full awareness of its effect, and Tan actually explains as much in his supporting work Sketches from a Nameless Land, published 3 years after the initial publication of the graphic novel. Quote, "I've always been interested in the idea of indirect illustration. In other words, trying to find a metaphorical equivalent for a subject or an experience, an imaginary representation rather than a literal one." Meaning the foreign at this point manifests itself as unclear in its specifics, but clearly oppressive and menacing presence. It's present at the train station at which the family separates, as a faint darkness hovering in the background. It is also what the chapter closes on after mother and child have seen the father off, walking back up the streets towards the spiked, flowing shadows that seem to have grown in number and are now covering the sky like dark clouds. Even the house's shadows on the street look reminiscent of the dark figures, as if the entire environment has succumbed to transforming into this threatening foreign element. Due to its nature in this circumstance, combined with the protagonist's decision to leave, the foreign is more aggressive, more intruding, and more prevalent here than it is in many later instances. It is also what sets the narrative into motion and a first powerful display of Tan's ability to communicate emotion rather than immediate meaning. Quote, "Tan uses unrecognizable versions of common items to disorient the reader, simulating the protagonist's experiences, engaging readers beyond simply understanding the story and toward empathizing with these characters and the people they represent." The first manifestation of the foreign in the foreign land is introduced in chapter 2 in the form of paper-like birds. In this case, what indicates that this site is foreign to the protagonist is not only the way he looks up in wonder, but also the more real-world origami bird he carries with him as a souvenir, showing a certain contrast in what he is used to when it comes to birds. However, just as with the dark entities, the significant point is that these creatures are foreign to the reader, and therefore they feel slightly out of place, albeit more gently than in the first chapter. In this, they also draw attention to the premonition that something new is about to enter the scene. Apart from the connotation that birds crossing above a ship announces that a coast is near, they also foreshadow the incoming foreign experiences. The confirmation of the suspicion comes after the arrival in the form of the immigration process that I'll get into a bit more in a little bit, to then immediately be enhanced further by a wide shot of the new city. There are unfamiliar vehicles, enormous strange statues, signs that bear letters similar to those on the title page, none of which readers can confidently draw meaning from. And yet, readers can still understand some of the sides through contextual knowledge. Interestingly, in this case, readers might even know less about what they're seeing than the protagonist. We're not fully aware of this, because we don't know what world knowledge he has, and we also still don't know what exactly of this is just metaphorical, and which is explicitly exactly what the world looks like. And so regardless of that, this double page makes it clearer than ever that the protagonist and the readers that have followed him have arrived in a place that is so overwhelmingly different that much of it defies even understanding by reference. This impression only grows stronger over the course of the protagonist's first days and weeks. He encounters strange animals, structures, plants, machines, and modes of transportation, filing systems, food, instruments, furniture, games. Everything is new and begs explanation, but he rarely gets one, and neither do we as readers. All along, the arduous journey to knowledge and familiarity is taken alongside the protagonist. It could even be argued that due to the novel speeding through time in several instances, most notably by illustrating the passing of a year through having a fantastical plant symbolize the 4 seasons, readers in fact gain less and less familiarity compared to the protagonist as time passes on. This further enhances the second, more important aspect in the reader, that of feeling foreign. All elements explained in discussing the foreign as environment evoke a foreign feeling through their unfamiliar appearance and the lack of associations that can be drawn from them. However, the arrival also succeeds in communicating this feeling on another, less direct but more overarching level. It starts even before the story, even before the cover page bearing unfamiliar letters. The insides of the book cover, as I mentioned earlier already, are filled with photographs, quote-unquote, portraits of people, which, as enlightened by Tan in Sketches, are actual passport-sized photographs from archives of the Ellis Island Museum of New York City. The varied attire and serious, even worried expressions of the people in these photographs, when combined with the novel's story, make it clear that these are immigrants of all backgrounds. People who, for whatever reason, decided to take the big, daunting step to leave one life behind and start another. While this does not necessarily evoke the same personal, identifying feeling of foreignness in most readers like many other elements, it sets the emotional background. Now, along with its more singular environmental aspects, the first overarching theme related to the foreign is the journey across the sea in Chapter 2. Through the gradual zoom from a family portrait in the protagonist's small compartment to the outside of the ship, to a view of the ocean that dwarfs even the mighty ship he travels on, readers are made to realize and share his sense of uncertainty and insignificance. The realization that in this wide world, one person has a very limited space he can truly oversee and be familiar with. This leads into the next site after the journey, a literal shipload of immigrants, most of them unfamiliar with each other and their surroundings, anxiously clutching suitcases and rough bundles huddled on the deck of a steamship, to quote Tan. It is another manifestation of the foreign in its most intuitive and literal form, and one of the poignant scenes that Tan based directly on a reference photo that he collected. Both the zoom-out technique and the combination with the image of other people of a similar fate are repeated in a later scene, in which the protagonist has arrived in his rented room. Once again, readers are made to experience the same feeling of worry and smallness as the protagonist. The next instance is a familiar way of experiencing foreignness displayed in an only partly familiar way. As part of the immigration process in the country he has come to, the protagonist is made to go through a confusing bureaucratic process. This is communicated through him looking more and more confused and frustrated, likely because he understands neither the language nor, partly through that, the proceedings themselves, while a comical amount of stamps and stickers is applied to his coat over the course of 12 panels. Even without having gone through a similar real-world ordeal themselves, readers can draw from this that the foreign is being portrayed here in the form of parody. Additionally, like before, even though readers are able to recognize the events from Tan's detailed portrayal, they are not able to understand the notes and stickers themselves either. In other words, the reader has the same amount of knowledge as the protagonist does. Tan intentionally, quote, plants the readers more firmly in the shoes of an immigrant character by extending the protagonist's confusion onto them. However, the most striking way in which the feeling of foreignness is communicated certainly is the language in The Arrival, or rather, the complete lack thereof. While in sketches, Tan notes that, quote, "It's not entirely correct to call it a wordless story. The only form in which actual, read written, read recognizable as words to the reader words is the unlegible, unrecognizable alphabet that never becomes decipherable on purpose." In all other instances which would usually involve language, and clearly do in the story, its only indicator are people's faces and their words being translated into imagery. This gives rise to a number of possible analyses, among them the idea that, for a long time, the protagonist has no voice in a quite literal sense. Not only does he not succeed in communicating with people because of a language barrier, but when he does, it happens through imagery, not through spoken word. The same way the entire graphic novel communicates meaning to the reader. Now, of course, this is part of the medium, and the implication of sound and spoken words within the story clearly exists. Yet part of the effect that this choice has is the reinforcement of the foreign, much more strongly for readers who are made to be all the more aware of their reliance on imagery, as they cannot even experience the few words that are exchanged. The Arrival never goes out of its way to explain. It makes its readers go through a process of understanding that is very similar to that of the protagonist. The second question that I concern myself with here is that concerning the choice of title for The Arrival. Clearly, other options would have been both available and viable, as is usually the case, making the final decision for the title meaningful. What might speak against this choice, and what, instead, supports it? Staying in line with Tan's approach to this complex topic, for the purpose of this video, what we refer to as the concept of arrival is mostly synonymous with familiarity and belonging, and the process required to gain a sense of both. The aim therefore becomes to showcase that arrival is in fact a process, and why it is so highly dependent on these two emotions when viewed as an abstract concept. In the spirit of building up an opposition to then make better arguments, let's start with possible objections to the title, The Arrival. A counterintuitive element are the numerous instances of departure. In fact, the entire story starts out with one. Likewise, the panel chosen to illustrate the second inside cover, taken from a scene directly before the arrival in the new city, shows the protagonist looking back, a pose that, if at all, only implies arrival in the most literal sense, physically arriving in a place. It does not, however, speak for a metaphorical arrival, that being the feeling of belonging, being wholly in one place with body, mind, and spirit. This is later reinforced by the protagonist's thoughts remaining with his family, although he is already in a new place, showcased most strongly by the holograph-like scene he sees, quote-unquote, in his suitcase when he first opens it up, arriving in his new living quarters. In fact, the detailed and varied portrayal of the foreign as a concept that takes up the biggest part of the novel seems to speak against choosing arrival as its namesake. But with that being said, let's look at the supporting aspects. Most simply, the protagonist's physical arrival in the strange land alone could be seen as important enough to warrant the title, to kind of turn around the opposite point I made just now, because it is a life-changing event, and it concludes the story's exposition. It is the central element without which the following story would not take place, and it might also be interpreted to mean the protagonist himself rather than his action of arriving, meaning he himself is the arrival. But while this literal aspect surely does play some sort of a role, it is unlikely to be what the title's meaning is limited to or even focused on, considering the way Tan subtly works with emotions and associated meaning throughout the entire graphic novel. It is much more likely that his aim is the conveyance of gradually growing familiarity and belonging, leading to a more metaphysical and complete form of arrival. The first example for not only literal but, let's say, actual arrival the protagonist encounters is a young woman that tells him of her dark past, her immigration process, and new life. At the point of her telling him this, she has clearly become a fully integrated citizen in this new society. Two more instances of the same pattern appear in the forms of the family father who invites the protagonist in for a meal, and an old co-worker at the factory who offers him a drink. All three of these people tell stories of loss and fear, of insecurity and worry, stories that all end with their current state, having sought refuge from lands overshadowed by fear. They also each introduce the protagonist to new things and ideas about his new homeland, things that he would have to consider foreign had he encountered them alone, but can learn about and grow accustomed to with the help of these earlier arrivals. None of these people he meets have forgotten where they came from or what they went through, and none of them are immune to new worries or fears, but they have built a new life. They have arrived. The implication this leaves with readers is that the protagonist, although initially worried by all the new information and foreign encounters, is in fact surrounded by people with similar faiths and stories that have simply already gained a greater sense of belonging than he has, mostly by virtue of the fact that they have been there longer. Finally, there is the arrival of the protagonist's wife and child in the closing chapter. Over the approximate year that the protagonist has spent in the new place at this point, he has grown accustomed to most aspects of daily life, as symbolized most strongly by the strange animal that started out as an unexpected house guest, or, as Tan himself puts it in an interview, an alarming intruder coming into the apartment, but has since become his companion. He also knows the food, the people, has had a few jobs, and knows how to get around. But without his family by his side, he could never make the final step. He could not truly arrive, not emotionally. Their physical arrival therefore makes possible the completion of his arrival and initiates their own process. And so we come back to this. The concept of arrival is not explained, but it is conveyed, bit by bit and in increasing amounts. As with the foreign, readers are invited along to explore and become familiar with what is introduced. It is by this very measure that readers share the experience of wonder and growing security of the protagonist that Tan portrays as the integral part of arrival. What remains now, after exploring these concepts of the foreign and familiarity and arrival, what remains is the question of how they relate and play off of each other. At first, it might not seem helpful to explore the foreign so deeply and in detail when the aim should be to communicate arrival and the associated feeling of familiarity. However, in a beautiful display of antithesis, the arrival manages to utilize this very contrast to make both concepts more meaningful and striking to the reader, making them both shine in their own right and ultimately work together to evoke a stronger sense of what it means to belong. To understand and examine the way Tan utilizes this interdependency of evoked meaning, arrival has to be seen as a continuous concept, a process rather than an instantaneous action or happening, such as the getting off of a ship or entering a new apartment. Tan makes it clear that this is an intended part of the process by putting an emphasis on the protagonist's gradual assimilation and growing familiarity with the world around him. The usual way immigrants find their way into a new life, certainly, but worth drawing attention to nonetheless as the basis for how the concept of arrival is viewed in The Arrival. The question then is not so much that of when an arrival can be seen as complete, as from the interpretation presented in The Arrival, it could even be argued that it never truly is, rather than why and how a sense of belonging grows stronger and makes a person feel like they have arrived. Tan himself offers his conclusion on these hard questions as the closing words in Sketches. Perhaps this is what belonging is, beyond the need to understand, comprehend, or conform to a place. It's the attachment of sincere feeling and meaning to an essentially mysterious world. As has been established here, the main point of the worlds in The Arrival being portrayed the way that they are is to evoke within readers the same sense of alienation and wonder that the protagonist experiences. It is to evoke and cause for identification, regardless of the personal circumstances and experiences of the readers outside of the reading experience. It emulates the innate mystery and inhibitions in permanently moving to a far-off, unfamiliar place where everything must be reinterpreted within a new context, quoting Tan in Sketches again. Culture, language, society, not to mention both natural and human-built environments. After having grown up with certain truths, immigrants are forced to assign meaning as if experiencing, quote, a second childhood. Perhaps even notice that what they always accepted as true and obvious is not so unambiguous after all. This phenomenon is both the integral aspect of the foreign and the key to arriving, and it is expressed to readers in part through familiar concepts translated into unfamiliar manifestations. Hot air balloons being used as common modes of transportation rather than just a leisure activity, clearly recognizable street musicians with unrecognizable instruments, street merchants selling oversized but otherwise familiar-looking eggs, or simply a scene at a barbershop with strange creatures surrounding the barber and his customer. All of these make it clear that something is different and that there is a lot that has to be learned and adjusted to. But it simultaneously lets on that the difference might not be as fundamental and overwhelming and complete as initially felt or suspected. This idea fits into a pattern that Tan uses throughout the entire graphic novel, an interplay of the clearly foreign and the timidly familiar to produce a feeling of growing belonging, i.e., arrival, that enhances both ideas. It starts with the very first few panels in which the initial indicators of a home are immediately contrasted with departure scenes, and later carries into the zoom-out sequences on the ship and the new apartment that I mentioned earlier. They, too, start with the shot, if we imagine a camera, resting on the familiar, only to then draw away from it and remind readers and the protagonist alike that the pressing reality is the contrasting foreign that is everywhere outside of the photograph and the suitcase, respectively. As time passes, however, this space of familiarity grows and extends to the protagonist's places of work, his colleagues, and acquaintances. And the same is all the more true for the companion animal that starts off as another reminder of the all-encompassing foreign, but then goes on to become a great source and even facilitator of growing familiarity. It is itself a representation of the bigger process of arrival that slowly but steadily develops throughout the story, the growing of a familiar space and an emotional connection with the new surroundings. Tan also uses the foreign to facilitate the expansion of familiarity in other instances, such as, for example, when the protagonist first encounters the gray-haired man's family pet. Its dark, spiked tail reminds him of the entities that invaded his home, which leads to his conversation partner telling him of his own haunted past. Not only does this foster connection and bring the two characters closer together, it also offers another opportunity for readers to empathize with the situation of many, if not all people in this city of hope, as, to quote Tan again, the unstated premise is that everyone in the city is actually an immigrant, each with their own stories of suffering and resilience. This circumstance also is an example of another pervasive, overarching anchor of familiarity that can easily be missed due to its readily assumed implicitness. Despite the fact that this city is filled with people from vastly different places and backgrounds, and even though the foreign is kept noticeable in all things that they encounter on their way to belonging, there is one constant exception: other people. Their expressions, behavior, and mannerisms are the only things that consistently stay familiar, no matter how superficially different they might initially seem to new arrivals, even when there is a language barrier, and act as facilitators for growing accustomed to all other facets of the city. They may be foreign to each other by language and culture, but they are not alien or otherworldly like most of the environment and the processes. Their spirit is so clearly recognizable that they stay the crucial element in allowing new additions to their community to feel at home and, indeed, at some point, arrive. Referring back to the inside cover mentioned earlier, those two pages play a big role in this detail. Although all of these people look so different in attire, ethnic background, even just plainly their individual facial features, and through that are a clear indicator of an involvement of the foreign, for which I brought them up earlier, they also all share the same expression. All of them are looking directly at the camera, and therefore the reader, with expressive eyes, a gaze that tells a story and provokes thought. Even though they are so different, they are connected through their desire for a better life, their ability to adapt, and quite simply put, their humanity, and a worried, maybe even fearful need to belong. This correlation lays the groundwork for empathy, familiarity, and turning each other's foreign qualities into new things to integrate into the experience of an arrival. Through all of these smaller components, the overarching effect of emphasizing the foreign is that it, in itself, makes arriving a crucial necessity. It constantly urges the protagonist to go through the process of arrival instead of allowing him to just transition seamlessly from one stage of life into the next. Of course, without so many foreign elements, his arrival would have been more instantaneous and a lot easier. But since they are there with them, it makes the result of that process all the more meaningful and climactic. And nothing captures this more than the last chapters. The crucial moment for the protagonist, after a long, detailed struggle with the readers as his empathetic and possibly even self-identifying companions, is when he is finally reunited with his family. But really, the fruit of all the protagonist's sacrifices and resilience, and presumably Tan's reason for going to such lengths to illustrate the foreign, is shown nowhere as clearly as on the last panel. Leading up to it, readers are shown the protagonist's daughter meeting a young woman with a map, presumably a recent immigrant. Having taken a look at where she is trying to go, the girl confidently points the woman into a direction with a smile on her face. She, as a representative of a new, less troubled generation, has arrived. So much so that, like previous immigrants could for her father, she can offer her help to others who are currently trying to do the same. This last moment captures the true meaning and reason behind the title. Now, wrapping that up in a bow, The Arrival takes a close look at what it means to be strange and what it takes to belong. In order to communicate to his readers something that can barely be described by words, Tan constructs a world that conveys meaning rather than explain it, because no explanation can fully replace experience. The foreign is integral to this instance of show don't tell because, in being the polar opposite of the main topic, it gives meaning to familiarity. Only through feeling foreign is it possible for the protagonist to eventually arrive, and only through accompanying him through this process can readers gain a sense of what these two interdependent feelings are like. This level of identification is made possible even for readers who have never gone through a similar experience themselves, because through details and constant confrontation with unfamiliar yet interpretable sights, Tan manages to put his readers in the protagonist's shoes. Both of the graphic novel's central concepts, the foreign and familiarity, precisely by being such fundamental opposites, serve to reinforce each other's portrayal and impact. Without one, the other loses meaning, to both the readers and the fictional characters. The foreign is the main component in evoking a strong desire for and a greater appreciation of familiarity. Because of this, it doesn't take away from or muddle the graphic novel's end point, as might be suspected initially, but rather allows it to be meaningful in the first place, as Antithesis tends to do. The Arrival as a title is what best refers to the graphic novel's story because arriving, in the sense of the path to belonging, is the basis for everything that the family and many other characters have lost and are looking for, and arguably the general basis for security and happiness, which is a state that all humans long for and end up struggling for when it isn't there. This has been one of my papers.